not necessarily. And I was the president's trauma surgeon for G7 conference, which was real interesting. When I ultimately did my strategic planning, a lot of it was in Korea, some was in places like Europe, but Korea, Japan, around the Pacific quite a bit. And as Richard kindly mentioned, some of the people you see on television or hear about, like General Kelly, the Chief of Staff, Admiral SRVDC, who was Supreme Allied Commander in NATO, Malcolm Nance, you might see him on CNBC or read their editorials in Time Magazine, or people I've worked with. I'm going to introduce you to 2 or 3 of them today, because I think it helps. Lectured, taught, still teach. By the time I finished, my uniform looked a lot different. As you can see on the bigger picture, I had a little more gleam on it than I did in that little picture in the lower right-hand corner. But my big assignments, I mentioned Naval Forces Special Command. I was a U.S. Strategic Command medical officer in Omaha. That's where they work on, nuclear warfare, the defense of the United States. I was a deputy surgeon for Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, which took me around the Pacific quite a bit those last 5-6 years. And I was the commander of Navy and Marine Corps medical forces in Korea. Again, a large commission kind of assignment that brought me in touch not only with the leadership of our military and the South Korean military, but with a lot of the diplomatic corps, which was very interesting. So I have 2 parallel careers, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned, I have this 3rd one, being dad. But I served in uniform. That's a pretty small group. Our generation is fading, and the generation now, very few in uniform. I read tons to understand history and policy, and I go to all kinds of lectures and conferences in places like Washington, D.C., or wherever they're having them, to hear from the experts. You'll see an occasional philosophical quote or literary quote as we're going through here. And I like movies and documentaries, and I'm going to use some clips, and hopefully they'll all run fine on this today. So let me take you to Afghanistan after that introduction. I call it the place where foreign armies go to die. And there's a real reason for that. Historically, Afghanistan was a buffer state in the great game of the British Empire in India. And they were always worried that the Russians would be coming down through some of those Berserkistans that you see on the map, like Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, and that they would invade, or they would invade through Iran and destroy the empire that the British had set up in the 19th century. So it was a key state, landlocked, but surrounded by a lot of other crucial areas. I like to quote Mark Twain when we start looking at maps, because he said God created war so that Americans would learn geography. And I think that's true. I think a lot of people don't have a clue where these countries are until suddenly they get on the news. And even then, they probably don't have a great idea. But let's take a look at Afghanistan. When we invaded in 2001, or when we got involved, there were 32 million people. You can see the number of languages and tribes, large and small, spread through this area. There were Pashtuns, there were Tajiks, there were Hazaris, Uzbeks, Imeks, Turkmen. I mean, there's tons of tribes, and they fight amongst themselves all the time. There's only one thing that ever unites the tribes, and that's an invasion by a foreign force. So who invaded them? Well, if you start back at 330 BC, Alexander the Great was stopped by them. The Indian Mauryas, same time period. The Muslim Arabs in the 7th century couldn't take Afghanistan. The Mongols under Genghis Khan in the 1200s couldn't stop them. Persians weren't successfully able to invade. The Mughal Empire were not able in the 1600s. The Sikhs tried in the 1750s. The British, slow learners here, tried twice, 1839 and 1878. Both times got their head handed to them. Soviets did it in 1979. And since 2001 with our NATO allies, we've been there, which brings me to another good quote, which is, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. I think there's no circumstance under which it's more true than this one. So let's go back. We're going to study the invasion of Afghanistan, but before we look at what we're involved in, we got to go back to 1979 and 1989 to get a feel for what happened there. At that time, the U.S. was opposing Russian intervention in Afghanistan. There was a coup in 1978. There was concern that this was a communist takeover, and the Carter administration began to supply lethal aid, primarily humanitarian aid in the millions of dollars. And then the Soviets invaded in December 1979, and kind of took over the country. The Afghans, as I said, unite when there's an invader, and they fought the tanks and the planes and the helicopter gunships on horseback and with ancient rifles. I mean, it was a wonderful, brave, amazing thing to see. Sort of like that scene in The Last Samurai where they charge the machine guns, you know, on horseback with their swords. But it was, you know, pretty much a slaughter. But then along comes somebody who tilted the table for it. And Charlie Wilson's War is what we're going to call it. Movie and book by the same name are very interesting to read. It's a little known congressman from rural Texas. His reputation was alcohol, drugs, partying, women. He was a wild man and didn't have a lot of legislative stuff, except he knew everybody and partied a lot. Even Rudy Giuliani investigated him at one point, but didn't get a conviction. A friend who was a socialite who knew a lot of people and diplomats explained the Afghan invasion to him and introduced him to some of the Afghan representatives who had come to this country to seek some aid. And he decided he was going to help fight the Soviets. Part of the reason may be that prior to him being a congressman, he was a Navy officer, I think for 5 years. And part of what he did was service in the Atlantic, looking for Russian subs and doing stuff in the Cold War. So he recruits a maverick CIA agent named Gus AVRAKOTOS, and they find the money somehow to buy weapons. And they use China and Israel and Egypt and other countries. Amazingly, they buy weapons and that they decide they want. They get matching money from the Saudis to bump up their budget, and they funnel the weapons through Pakistan. So reading the book and seeing the movie, very interesting. It gives you a view. And he was also responsible for developing the Stinger missile. He was pushing very hard because they needed to find a way to take on the Russian helicopters, as you'll see when I show you a clip. So how did we use our foreign policy in 1979, 1989, in this time period? Well, let me show you a quick video from his movie, which not totally accurate, but gives you a little taste. Uh-oh, where did my taste go? Let's see.
The Milan anti-tank missile. We've got 300 in the field. Yeah. Let's kill some Russians.
Voting to pump up the money for the freedom fighters is the only way for the Northeastern liberal to prove that he's serious.
How much are you asking for?
I want to go from 70 million to 100 million. If you vote for me, I can deliver the Black Caucus to the farm sector.
Совершенно больше.
Well, hopefully our American pilots have better radio discipline. But during this time period, because of the Stinger missile deployment and all the other things we were pumping through, purchased around the world and pumped through Pakistan and into Afghanistan to fight the Russians, along comes the election of Ronald Reagan. He had a doctrine that we're going to read a little bit about, which stated in 1985, we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent, from Afghanistan to Nicaragua, to fight aggression and secure the rights which have been ours since birth. So that was kind of what he was pushing, and some of you can remember the Nicaragua affair with the Contras and in Afghanistan. These were all sort of under the cover of the CIA, not really out in front of the public. And this was the strategy of the Reagan administration to block the Soviet Union in the late Cold War years, and it was the centerpiece of our foreign policy during that time. So that led us to Operation Cyclone. And Operation Cyclone, which really started sort of in 1979 with Jimmy Carter with $500,000 in humanitarian aid, was really the longest and most expensive covert CIA operation ever undertaken. This was a very big deal by the time it was over. The US helped expel, bankrupt, and humiliate the Russians, and probably helped their government to fall. And it probably had a great deal to do with the loss of confidence in the government. It also caused great economic problems because they just couldn't keep up. So I'm going to take you to another clip in that movie just for fun, because I think it highlights what we did at the end of this event and how we used our win.
There was wild jubilation inside the country of Afghanistan as last weekend it became the first country in history to defeat the mighty Soviet Union.
The retreat of Soviet military power from Afghanistan is complete. The last of Russia's regular army invasion force is out. Fear and uncertainty were mixed with joy today as the commander of Soviet troops followed the lines, took his men across the border. CBS News Moscow correspondent Barry Peterson begins our coverage.
It was the last hurrah, the final Soviet combat troops crossing the friendship bridge on the border between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. The Soviet commander returned to Soviet military intervention in other countries is now over.
Well, I've told you. Told me what? All we had to do, shoot down the helicopters. So, not for nothing, but do you know the story about the Zen master and the little boy? As a matter of fact, there was a little boy, and on his 14th birthday, he gets a horse. And everybody in the village says, how wonderful, the boy got a horse. And the Zen master says, we'll see. 2 years later, the boy falls off the horse, breaks his leg, and everybody in the village says, how terrible. And the Zen master says, we'll see. Then a war breaks out, and all the young men have to go off and fight, except the boy can't because his leg's all messed up. And everybody in the village says, how wonderful.
Now, the Zen master says, we'll see.
So you get it.
No, because I'm stupid.
You're not stupid. You're just in Congress.
Send them money.
You start with the roads, one of the schools, factories.
Gus, now it's a party.
Restock the sheepbirds. Give them jobs. Give them hope.
I'm trying.
Now we'll try harder.
I'm fighting for every dollar.
Yeah.
I took you from 5 million to $1 billion. I broke the ice of the Sing and the Milan. I got a Democratic Congress in lockstep behind a Republican president.
Well, that's not good enough, because I'm going to hand you a code word classified NIU right now that's going to tell you that the crazies have started rolling into Kandahar like it's a fucking bathtub.
Yes, you could depress a bride on the wedding.
Hey. Listen to what I'm telling you.
So what's he telling him? He's telling him, yeah, we won the battle, but the next step is you have to do something to reconstitute the country, reconstruction. We didn't do a very good job. So what is our outcome of our investment of billions and billions of dollars? You would be staggered by the amount of money. So our outcome, Soviets left. It was the first time they had ever been defeated. The Russian financial support ended in '92, so that was a big win for us. The Afghan central government, unfortunately, also fell in 1992 when the money stopped. And then civil war broke out between the warlords and the various tribes. And as you know, Afghanistan entered a period of chaos for all practical purposes. We walked away from providing the support that you saw Gus recommend in that particular clip. We didn't help infrastructure, education, healthcare, agriculture, a lot of problems. We were just kind of happy to bloody the Russians' nose, and then we were one and done. Short-sighted approach. As you know, civil war broke out between the tribes and ethnic groups, and there's sure lots of them, as I showed you on the map. This let the Taliban take control of the central part of the country. And it also allowed Al-QAEDA to operate on the Afghan-Pakistan border, which is something that we had to deal with later. But they moved there because it was a safe zone and they were welcome. So this operation was huge, and you know, billions were spent to defeat the Soviets. And so I've got to ask you, if you were my class, I'd say, how would you grade our efforts in Afghanistan from 1979 onward to the time we expelled the Soviets, and then 1992, and we kind of walked away? You know, think about that for a minute. We'll come back to it, because should we have done differently? Should be, you know, it's very easy to see it in hindsight, but it's something we should definitely talk about. Afghanistan descended into a Taliban nightmare, as you know. If you want to get a taste of it, read Kite Runner, although it's fiction. It's very well written, and it's a really good sort of look at what was going on inside the country at that time. Interestingly enough, that a lot of people don't realize is Pakistan used our money to develop their nuclear program. So probably less than half of all those billions of dollars actually made it into weapons that made it into Afghanistan. The Pakistanis were siphoning the money off. And if you read the book Deception, it's extremely well researched and footnoted as to where a lot of our money went. And every president turned a blind eye during that time period, especially Reagan. They so much wanted to stick it to the Soviets that they didn't care that Pakistan, which is a fairly unstable country, started building and successfully built nuclear weapons and technology that they shared with other countries in the area, which is really bad. So comes 9/11 a decade later. You know, we forgot about Afghanistan. You know, terrorists hijacked 4 US planes. I can still remember that morning getting a phone call from the Pentagon because planes had crashed into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon. And, you know, so I'm going to take you back in time to this time period when we woke up to a new reality and a new threat.
Oh my.
Pretty dark day. So I'm going to take you from that moment to another movie, which, you know, has some elements of truth, maybe a little fanciful, but I think everybody will see where I'm going with this a little bit. So this is the movie Vice. Christian Bale has played a lot of roles like Tom Hanks did in that earlier movie. I thought he was amazing in this one.
Mm-hmm. By all accounts, what people saw in that room on that terrible day, there was confusion, fear, uncertainty. But Dick Cheney saw something else that no one else did. he saw an opportunity. So it's no surprise that when a monotone, bureaucratic vice president came to power, we hardly noticed. He achieved a position of authority that very few leaders in the history of America ever had.
Vice President, he started this country.
He started forever changing the course of history for millions and millions of lives. And he did it like a ghost, with most people having no idea who he is or where he came from.
So to this day, I'm still kind of astounded by the things that happened that I would have considered not part of our American institutions. Guantanamo, people have been in prison for 19 years. Renditions, which is basically torturing prisoners to get information. There's a lot of things that we did that don't make me very proud. And we're going to come back to that later because we're going to see some more as we get further and further into this mess. So George Bush, you know, they wound him up. They gave him a little speech to read, put him on TV, and he addresses Congress and he talks about the Great War on Terror, where we got this name. And he says, our war on terror begins with Al-QAEDA, but it does not end there. Probably the single biggest mistake that we did was right there. Let's see what he says.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-QAEDA terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. We are joined in this operation by our staunch friend, Great Britain. Other close friends, including Canada, Australia, Germany, and France, have pledged forces as the operation unfolds. More than 40 countries in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and across Asia have granted air transit or landing rights. Many more have shared intelligence. We are supported by the collective will of the world. At the same time, the oppressed people of Afghanistan will know the generosity of America and our allies. As we strike military targets, we will also drop food, medicine, and supplies to the starving and suffering men and women and children of Afghanistan. We did not ask for this mission, but we will fulfill it. The name of today's military operation is Enduring Freedom. We defend not only our precious freedoms, but also the freedom of people everywhere to live and raise their children free from fear.
Well, what did we do? We attacked Al-QAEDA in Afghanistan. Began October 2001, about a month after the 9/11 stuff. The ground war was primarily done by special forces with some air support. A coalition of a number of countries moved in to take over the country and drive out the Taliban and Al-QAEDA. And Kabul fell in about a month. And we brought our own guy into office there. It was amazing to see these guys, special forces guys, some of whom spoke the language, riding horseback with the good guys, whichever side was fighting with us at that moment, and driving out the Taliban and Al-QAEDA. Pretty amazing. But let's look at it from the other side of history. What did the people who were opposing us think?
Sometime after sunset, a group of men gathered together in Kandahar to savor the moment they made history. Televisions had been banned in Afghanistan, but these men were honored guests. Osama bin Laden and his Al-QAEDA faithful were there to watch the horror of 9/11 unfold. What Al-QAEDA called the Manhattan Raid. So the West invaded Afghanistan.
was a belief it could be done quickly with a very light footprint. We could be in and we could be out again. And we ended up doing neither one thing nor the other.
Instead, 47 nations, America and Britain especially, have been sucked ever deeper into a quagmire.
Oh, I used to ask myself every time I went to Afghanistan, what are we doing here?
I guess we're winning the hearts and minds of the people. So let's see what we got from this event. We got rid of the Taliban from the central capital, and Al-QAEDA was vanquished out to Kandahar province, and we established a democracy. Went pretty fast. In June 2002, Hamid Karzai, who was kind of the favored presidential candidate, was brought in by the US to run the government. He became Afghan's first democratically elected president. And one of my friends was actually on this helicopter ride talking to him all the way into the capital. Interesting guy.
That leader was a Pashtun who teamed up with US Special Forces at a secret airbase near the Pakistan border. His name was Hamid Karzai.
In 2001, my mission was to link up with Hamid Karzai. I liked him immediately. I can't say I've worked with many Afghan warlords before, so maybe they're all equally personable. But Karzai was a very modest man, very polite.
Captain Amarine's mission was to help Karzai raise an army against the Taliban. The Taliban had retreated south and were regrouping for a last stand in their spiritual home in Kandahar. During a chaotic day of fighting, Karzai and Amarine learned that hundreds of Taliban fighters were closing in.
Basically, as all hell was breaking loose and we're waiting for the Taliban to overrun our location and kill everybody, Karzai was standing out there in the street, calmly directing people and trying to gather up guerrillas to fight with us. He was definitely cool under pressure. We received a phone call late at night. Everybody was asleep except me and Karzai. After he hung up, it was like, you know, oh, who is that? And he says to me, oh, that was an intermediary from Mullah Omar. I kind of did a double take. I'm like, what did Mullah Omar want?
The Taliban leader wanted to explore the terms of a surrender. Provided the Taliban returned peacefully to their homes, the war would be over. At least that's what the Taliban say Hamid Karzai promised Mullah Omar.
He promised to him that this is your country, to live in your country peacefully with all your natural rights and the human rights. But they were not allowed to live peacefully in this country.
Washington rejected a deal with the Taliban. Their Afghan mission was kill or capture, and they made no distinction between the Taliban and Al-QAEDA. Do you think that was a mistake?
I do. Certainly below the level of Mullah Omar, to have considered the political approach, which would offer the Taliban possibilities to participate in the political process, provided that they would cut their ties with international terrorism. I think that history will judge that missed opportunity.
So huge missed opportunity. December 2002, they were ready to go back to their homes, more or less lay down their weapons. Who knows if it's true, but the US did not want to actually go forward with any kind of a peace deal or peace discussion. We'll touch on this again because it's a huge missed opportunity. Would have been nice to have ended this right then and there. So I'm going to introduce you to the Powell Doctrine. Although it's not really the gospel, I look at it from time to time. He has a number of points. I'm going to show you a couple of them that he says whenever you're considering doing one of these missions with the military, you want to think about all of these issues. And I'm going to show you a couple. Is a vital national security interest threatened? Do we have a clear, attainable objective? is the action supported by the American people? And do we have broad international support? So we'll have a quiz on these towards the end because I think it's important. You'll see where I'm going. I think this is really important. You know, there's a couple more things that he has in his doctrine that are but we don't have time. So I just want you to start with these. So this whole deal sounds at this point like a happy ending. Our national security was enhanced. We hammered Al-QAEDA and did what we went to Afghanistan to do. We upheld our international image of strength and, you know, doing the right thing. We had very clear and defined objectives at that point to disrupt the Taliban and crush Al-QAEDA and then restore a neutral government or a democracy, which is a whole nother issue. And I think things are pretty much supported by the American people and also by our allies and nations around the world. Pretty much everything lined up with the Powell Doctrine. And I think that first year in Afghanistan, we did everything we set out to do and did it as we said we were going to do it. However, Karzai and his government, problems, problems, problems. He represents one tribe. He's a Pashtun. There's friction between all the tribes. They're all jockeying for position. We'll hear a little bit from another one of my colleagues about that as we go forward. The government seemed unable or unwilling to provide services. We were pouring money by the billions into Afghanistan, and it seemed to just disappear. But it disappeared because of the nepotism and corruption, which is how things sort of work in Afghanistan. It was real interesting. Some of the aid workers were noticing these incredibly large mansions springing up from the reconstruction funds. All of a sudden, people were getting rich, but none of it was getting out to the people we were trying to help. Interesting. There's a new minister of planning was brought back from overseas to try and help his country, and he has something to say about that.
He agreed that only if he could investigate Karzai's cabinet.
I said to Mr. Karzai, we must start it to find the corruption in the staff of ministry, in the staff of presidential palace, in the Supreme Court.
What was his response?
He refused. He refused that I start the corruption in top level of Afghan state. It was the reason that he didn't accept my condition.
So you left the government?
I left the government.
In August.
So we're not making any progress. And this goes on for a couple of years. The people they brought back to try and help, like this minister who wanted to fight corruption in government, certainly wasn't going to be allowed to do that. I guess it's like getting rid of all the inspector generals in our government, right? We don't want to look too hard for any corruption. So we have a couple choices. Should we stay the same course? 6 years down the road here, we're still trying to prop up Karzai. Should we pull out and say we won? That's what we did in Vietnam. Should we put more troops in and try to get an edge? It's known as the surge. We did it in Iraq, which we could talk about sometime. So a 6-month extensive review was done. There were several groups involved. One was the Council of Colonels, which was where H.R. McMaster was involved. There were several State Departments with a guy named Steve Hadley and some of the other senior executives in the administration. And what they decided was, after talking to everybody, they talked to General Petraeus and McChrystal and the CIA and defense, and even the Afghan government, they made a plan. And unfortunately, this is the plan that President Obama was talked into rolling out, for better or for worse.
I want to speak to you tonight about our effort in Afghanistan and the strategy that my administration will pursue to bring this war to a successful conclusion.
After years of drift, America seemed to set its compass. It was getting out of Afghanistan, but not before having one last crack at the Taliban.
If I did not think that the security of the United States and the safety of the American people were at stake in Afghanistan, I would gladly order every single one of our troops home tomorrow.
To reverse the Taliban's momentum, the generals told the president there'd need to be a military surge. The president sent another 30,000 troops to war. This has taken the total number of troops in Afghanistan to 142,000.
What you do today is to live in that shit for the next 10, 20, 30 plus years.
This president decided that once in, he was in all the way. and that he needed to give our commanders in Afghanistan the troops they felt necessary in order to turn the situation around.
For the first time, we had, if you like, the end state quantified in military terms. Up until then, we'd just been increasing bit by bit, with never any clue of when enough was going to be enough.
The purpose of the surge is to clear ground held by the Taliban.
Smoke it!
Oh yeah, baby! Right, Jack.
The Americans want to hand over the whole of Afghanistan to Afghan security forces by 2015. When the surge was announced, the British Foreign Secretary and his special envoy thought this was wildly ambitious.
We asked a very senior Afghan minister how long the Afghan authorities would stay in Helmand after we left. And the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, was expecting an answer 3 years, 6 years, you know, however long it took. And the answer from this minister, very close to President Karzai, knows Helmand very well, his answer with a broad grin was 24 hours, Foreign Secretary, 24 hours.
The Americans say that since then there's been much progress from a $12 billion a year training program. Yet they're building an Afghan army and police force whose cost neither they nor the Afghans can sustain. And corruption and drug taking are still endemic, even while on guard duty. Ultimately, as long as the Afghan government lacks legitimacy with the overwhelming majority, its security forces may not be able to hold the Taliban at bay.
At the end of the day, if you're going to follow a counterinsurgency strategy, you must be true to its precept. And one of the principal precepts is, in a counterinsurgency, you're only as good as the government you represent and serve. In this case, it's the government of Afghanistan.
So you're only as good as the government that you serve in a counterinsurgency. This is really important. And even the Afghan government thought that the hold on Kandahar would only last 24 hours, no matter how many bombs and rockets we blew into there. Who did we fail to consult? You know, we consulted the CIA, the DIA, General Petraeus, General McChrystal, you know, the Afghan leadership, but we didn't consult the Afghan people about, was the government doing what they needed to be doing? Did they deserve your support? Is our money getting out to where it belongs? And this is sort of reminiscent of Vietnam. It's almost like we're making the same mistakes again. And as Yogi Berra would say, it's deja vu all over again. You would have even thought that the British, after getting their heads handed to them twice in Afghanistan, would know better to jump in with us, but they did it. But they had some diplomats who were fairly sharp.
For some time, Britain's special representative to Afghanistan had been arguing the only way out was to start talking to the Taliban. Last summer, Sharad Cooper-Coles attended a summit of Afghan experts at Chequers, hosted by David Cameron.
Stabilizing Afghanistan isn't a question of pumping in more and more troops or training up a vast national army to garrison the country. It's creating, arriving at a political settlement, and then using military force to underpin that settlement, but not to deliver it.
The simple conclusion that we came to is that most insurgencies down history and around the world have ended in two ways. One, with some military success, but secondly, with some political process and solution as well.
The new Prime Minister decided it was time to take political risks to start talking to the Taliban. Last February, Washington agreed, something they'd previously opposed. The Americans say a Taliban team, including an aide to the leader Mullah Omar, are now engaged in exploratory talks.
So we'll see. Still talking, but it took 10 years to get to that point. So interesting Persian proverb I want to share with you. They're the next country over, so I think it relates to this. It takes one madman to throw a stone down the well. and it takes 10 wise persons to get it out. I think that really applies here, and I'm going to show you why a little bit. So here's my colleague H.R. McMaster getting interviewed, and I think he has an interesting comment that also brings this home about why we aren't winning. Here's the question.
Why can't we just win, HR? Well, the initial strategy was very successful militarily, but it was actually ran counter to the true nature of war, and that war is political. So what you're doing militarily has to be able to bridge into a sustainable political outcome. The Mujahideen era militias, who we super empowered with special forces, intelligence professionals, and air power, were able to effect essentially state capture over nascent state institutions and functions after the collapse of the Taliban regime. Of course, the Taliban had destroyed any institution we would have recognized as such anyway. Right. And so then these militias morphed into essentially organized crime networks that were affiliated with a criminal objective, but really a political objective, which was mainly to consolidate power in advance of a post-US Afghanistan.
So war is one element of political change and politics. So a very important concept is that we looked at this as totally as a military event. And as HR says, the military event is really just one piece of our foreign policy, and there needed to be other good pieces. Let's look at it from the side of the people in Afghanistan and some of the leadership of the adversaries.
The Americans may have removed bin Laden from the scene, but what of his original objectives?
The objective of September 11th was to goad the United States into invading Afghanistan. Then they could destroy an American army in Afghanistan, shatter our will at home, and lead the United States and our allies to get out of the Islamic world.
Bin Laden did provoke the longest war in America's history, and the financial cost has become unsustainable, never mind the human toll.
They're gonna say.
So, did we have a clear and obtainable objective? In 2001, 2002, which, you know, when we looked at that earlier, I think the answer is probably correct. But then the question was, are we going to be able to have all the warring and fractious tribes? You know, we just assumed they'll get along and play nice. And if we put enough money into the pot, they'd be happy living with each other and keeping, you know, Karzai in power, even though they didn't like his tribe. So we have to look at what's been accomplished. So what's our ROI and what was our cost? Phase one, I think successfully we hammered Al-QAEDA and the Taliban, which was our original goal. Phase two, reconstruction and nation building. You know, we didn't work out very well for a lot of reasons because we supported a corrupt government, which was rife with bribery and nepotism, and we just rained death and destruction down on anybody that we thought was an enemy. And we humiliated a lot of people. We've made a lot of enemies. Sun Tzu, if you read his book, I love this quote, which says, "You don't go to bed at night with more enemies than you started with in the morning." And that really applies here. You know, we were the good guys for about a month. And, you know, the same is true of the conflict in Iraq, if you think about it. But then things went downhill. So let me show you why things went downhill. Here's one clip. This is a video documentary that was taken by a Marine who, after he came home and was discharged from the Marine Corps, went back to Afghanistan to film scenes of what was going on because he was very disturbed by what he had been deployed to do. Oops, go back. There you go.
Marines doing drugs, making mistakes.
That's the wrong building.
And potentially making new enemies while deployed in Afghanistan. Yet uninformed about the 18-year-long war. No discussion of the tens of thousands of Afghan civilians killed in the war. But the filmmaker hopes to give American viewers a better understanding of what they and the US military are up against. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
You know, that scene where he points his 45 at that kid on the donkey, I'm horrified by that. I realize he's under a lot of stress and I wasn't there, but again, we're invaders, basically. So what did it cost us? The Watson Institute says that we spent over $6 trillion through 2018. I'm going to try and get a current estimate one of these days. And there's a Harvard economist, Linda Blimes, who says the war costing $6 trillion, but we haven't looked at the cost of replacing all the worn out equipment, all the helicopters and other equipment. We haven't talked about servicing the national debt. That's not in that 6.2 trillion. And her big concern is veterans health care, which we know over 30 or 40 years can reach $6 trillion that she worked out with herself and Dr. Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist. Going to be hugely expensive. We've had roughly 2,300 American military deaths, 1,700 civilian contractor deaths. We don't know for sure because when we had those 140,000 troops in Afghanistan, we had almost 200,000 contractors hired for Kellogg, Brown, and Root and for Blackwater Security so that we could hide the number of troops really in the country. But they report to the Department of Labor and it's voluntary. So we don't really know how many contractor fatalities. We just, that's a broad estimate. And we have had over 20,000 troops wounded. By the same token, the civilian toll is very high. Over 157,000 people estimate by the UNHCR since 2001, and many of those are civilians. We probably created over 2 million refugees, according to UNHCR. And you can look this up at Watson Brown EDU. They have a lot of statistics, graphs, and things on this information. It's open source. So how does a nation really do reconstruction and nation building successfully? Well, there was a time when nations did do this well, and the British example in India is what I want to look at. General Abraham Roberts spent 50 years in India, working his way up to doing the projects he wanted to do, and his son, Field Marshal Frederick Roberts, spent another 40-some years in India. So between them, they had 92 years of basically father-son doing social engineering projects in India, and they were fairly successful at it. So we send our young troops for 12-month rotations, and we're expecting some kind of a good result when it took the British decades to do something like this in India. In this case, the means don't match the goals. This conflict requires different tools. There's a couple of guys I want to quote to you from the Pentagon who've been writing some papers about this. There's a difference between conventional war, insurgencies, and fighting extremism like the Taliban. You have to see things as they are and not create an alternative reality that kind of fits your story. And we've had an alternative reality now for 19 years. Unfortunately, the fact is that we aren't welcome in many of these parts of the world and probably have no business there, in my opinion. And there's just no tolerance for our heavily armed troops knocking down the doors of the people there. I mean, the things that we do, the buildings we blow up, the kids on the donkey where he took them off the donkey with the 45, I mean, we're really not making a lot of friends. So I would consider this 19 years of military intervention in Afghanistan to be 1 year of relative success, but overall it's 19 years of failure. Partly, I'm told we overinflated the assessment of the terrorist risk. We led to this big counterterrorism campaign and a foreign invasion. Did it really protect us from, other terrorist events? Most of the ones that have happened in the intervening 19 years were from homegrown terrorists. The Florida nightclub massacre, the shooting in San Bernardino. These weren't coming out of the mountains of Afghanistan. We adopted a strategy of military intervention, and we forgot that military is simply one part of foreign policy and political intervention. And I think we need to go back to doing intelligence and law enforcement and get the military out of Afghanistan if we're going to look for the threat against the U.S. homeland. We're looking in the wrong place. It's not going to come from some guy in a village in Afghanistan. And I want to just give you a taste of my shipmate and fellow Marine, General Mattis, who, as you know, was Secretary of Defense up until he reached the point where he simply couldn't take it anymore. But he has something to say about foreign policy and the importance of the Department of State.
That the international development budget is helpful to us in providing national defense for our country?
Yes, sir. I would start with the Department of State budget, and frankly, they need to be as fully funded as Congress believes appropriate. Because if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately.
He always had a way of expressing himself that got everybody's attention. You don't fund the State Department to do diplomacy and other things like foreign aid. I need to buy more ammunition. We're going to have to fight more. So, as I said, one of the writers who writes a lot for the Pentagon says the fight against extremists will be done by bridging gulfs between nation states and ethnic groups and solving conflicts, preventing new conflicts. You can do a quick read. And forging close relationships between intelligence agencies and the development agencies. So development's important. We probably could have got more mileage out of the Peace Corps in this event than sending in, brigade after brigade of soldiers. So Thomas Barnett, who wrote that, also wrote that populations that are disconnected from economic and social well-being are populations at risk. If they're here in our cities where people have no hope, they tend to go towards crime. If there's some of these other countries where the country is a basket case, they may wind up, being involved in narco-terrorism. And if we're bombing their village, they might decide terrorism is the answer since they have, no other life going forward. He's written a lot of things about where the military really should be going. A very good author. His book, Pentagon's New Map, was excellent. So last but perhaps the most important, people everywhere yearn for a better life for themselves and their kids. And without hope, as Thomas Barnett said, they turn to the dark side. And unfortunately, I think we've turned a lot of kids and families to the dark side by doing what we did in Afghanistan. It was a real big error, 19 years of error. So I'm going to stop. It must be getting close to an hour. I have one or two more things to say, but I would like to entertain some questions if Brody or Roger has seen any chats or gotten any emails or anything that anybody wants
everyone, to say. Can you hear me, Admiral?
Sure.
Yeah, can everyone, put in your chat questions if you have some. I have a couple myself, but want to get everybody involved in this discussion since Admiral's done such a great job of outlining this disaster. And unfortunately, it seems like Afghanistan is the place that countries go to die. They try to solve something that doesn't seem to be solvable without the local input. One of the questions I have is when I think is the dichotomy between the military and the civilians. Whose responsibility is it to just understand what you're getting into? Does the military, does the civilians kind of supposed to study the issue, look at the history and go ahead, or does the civilian leadership say, hey, military, give us a plan based on what you've seen in the past?
Well, that's a whole nother lecture, but I'm glad you asked the question. In a normal administration, historically, what's done is the president has an issue that he wants to tackle, and he gets his military advisors, his intelligence guys from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA in the loop. You get the State Department so you can talk to your ambassadors and your foreign country experts. You get all the stakeholders, including your allies. And you sit them down and you say, here's what I think we do. Please present me my options. Tell me what we can do, how we can do it, how much it will cost, who will it affect. And so you need to ask those questions. And then usually they feed into the National Security Council, which tries to synthesize all the information and say, Mr. President, here are your choices. And then usually, like I said, historically, a president will select that choice and issue the orders to go do whatever it is to do that he's asked for an action item on. Great question. Thank you. Anybody else have one or two you want to shout out?
Yeah, good.
Shout out?
Another question. I don't see any questions, but oh, okay. I see one here from Brian. Is there any hope of rebuilding the State Department after Trump's dismantling?
Can you say it again? Is there any hope of building the state?
Of rebuilding the State Department after Trump's dismantling?
Excellent question. So Since this administration took office, at which time Rex Tillerson started to dismember the State Department for reasons that aren't clear, I thought he was bad, but after he left, it's worse. They've lost 35% of their senior foreign service officers and ambassadors, the people who actually knew things about these countries, who had lived in them, maybe spoke the language, had been, in those areas for a long time. So, as I ask my friends, what do they think? They think that a lot of these people are not coming back, even if there's a change in administration, and it'll probably take a decade to rebuild the State Department into something that functions effectively. And so we've really, really shot ourselves in the foot by getting rid of all these professionals like Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Yovanovitch. And there's many, many other senior leaders who are gone. The entire desk that dealt with Korea, every single one was gone because they couldn't come up with the answer that this president wanted when he rushed off to, hug Kim in Singapore. So pretty much all those guys are gone. It'll take years to rebuild the State Department. Excellent question.
Admiral Baker, this might be similar, but we have a question. The question is, if we diverted some of the military budget to diplomacy, would it help world peace?
Well, I don't know about world peace because there's a lot of friction points in the world, and I don't know how much money we could put that might get India and Pakistan to get along or to solve things in the Middle East. But I can tell you that given the size of the military budget and all the little parts that are related to it, we're spending about $1 trillion a year. And that $1 trillion a year, what we're doing with it mostly is building M1A1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles and all the tools from some war that we fought 25 or 30 or 40 years ago. And so a lot of this money is being spent to mollify stakeholders like the congressman who owns the tank factory in Lima, Ohio. He's never going to allow an appropriation to go forward that takes money away. The Army didn't even want those tanks, by the way, in the 2020 budget, and Congress passed it through that they had to buy them anyway. Is that where we needed to put, a couple of $1 billion? Probably not. So yeah, we need to divert the money, but we need to divert it to a lot of places. Actually, I'd like to use that to segue into my final thoughts so that we can all get on with the day. There's other costs. We lost a lot of our allies in this. Everybody now looks at the U.S. as an unreliable leader, and we're certainly not leading in the COVID fight. Our image around the world has really suffered from this. We're not trusted. The U.S. doesn't keep its word, not only in Afghanistan, with the Iran nuclear deal and a lot of other things. We're just not trusted anymore. The people of this region, Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever that is, they're virulently anti-American now. And we've made thousands of enemies. So we destabilized the entire Mideast. And, we haven't even talked about the cost of the U.S. economy. There's a lost opportunity of not investing the war dollars in other sectors of our economy, which would be things like infrastructure or research and development, and maybe vaccines. Local government, the current wars are paid by bonds, basically. So our budget deficit is getting higher, the national debt's getting higher, which is going to cause problems down the road. Your kids are going to be paying for a long time on the war borrowing. So we squandered the opportunity. This is where we were on 9/11. We were on our way to Afghanistan to hammer Al-QAEDA because that's where their guys trained. This is the Bella Wood, which is an LHA, amphibious landing helicopter vessel. We lost a lot of opportunity costs here. And, an opportunity cost is a benefit or a profit or value that you acquire in lieu of something else. So it's like you give your kids some money and you say, yes, you can spend it on candy today, or you can put it in your account for college tomorrow, or something in between. But we could have spent that money on a lot of things that we've wasted in the last 19 years, and we're still wasting. We're still fighting and building for the last war. It's crazy. And it's almost like we're going back in time to make the mistakes that have made many times before. So my conclusion, U.S. foreign policy, we suffer from hubris. And what I mean by that is we're arrogant, that the American way is always better. Our government style is always better. We fail to learn people's language and history and culture and what they want. And the world's most powerful military really has been used without proper strategy planning and understanding of what the mission really was. The mission just kept sliding into a morass. And we've just alienated all the countries in that area, even the ones that were pretending to be our allies, like the Pakistanis, who really are not our allies and not our friends. And so there's a big effect on the military. Guys are exhausted. Some of the guys I know did 6, 7, 8 tours, and their families are pretty much gone, and their life is pretty much toast. All our equipment's really bad. We've got trillions and trillions of national debt, and we're going to need trillions and trillions more now to spend on things. So what's our result? Well, we ended World War II leading the world. Everybody wanted to come to America, emulate America, and learn English and everything. That we really achieved a lot. We were the last great country standing at the end of the war, and we've used our most powerful military in the world in ways that are terrible. And you know, this most powerful and expensive military has not won a war in 75 years. So if you think about history, that was the gist of the course that I taught for Osher Lifelong Learning over 6 weeks, is that when I looked at the history of where our military was used, of which I was a part, I was really very, very disappointed. And it made me very contemplative about why these decisions were made in the way they're made. And I think it's important for us to think about this, teach our kids about it, search for transparency and correct information. I think it's really important. So what's our final cost? You know, we've lost American influence and power around the world. Our image is really low right now for a lot of reasons, as a beacon of freedom and liberty, and even just leading the fight on COVID. Now we're just not doing it. And unfortunately, I think the sun has started to set on the American century. I think from 1920, you know, we got involved in World War I and began to influence things around the world till 2020. We really were leading every way, not only politically and militarily and economically, but culturally. And I think the sun has set on our century, and now China's going to probably hand us our lunch along with several other countries, but it's unfortunate. So I'm going to end at that point. I think I've talked long enough, and if anybody has any questions, I'll hang out.
Admiral, I had just one. Oh, sorry.
I have a question. Admiral Baker, sometimes in your class, you suggested that the generals would say there was no way to win the war. And you made it seem as though the State Department was the one that wanted the war. But in Afghanistan, did the generals think they could win the war, or what individuals were responsible for not having good nation building?
Well, you're asking me a really tough question, because you know, the generals and admirals are asked for their opinion, and usually the opinion is, can you do this? And usually the response that they come back with is, you know, if I have X number of troops, tanks, and planes, I think this is what we can accomplish. You know, they didn't ask them, how should you shape Afghanistan for the 21st century after we kick out the Taliban? That was really a State Department question, but somehow the State Department wound up playing second fiddle to the military. And the White House, for the most part, went around the State Department and told the military what the goal was. You know, like when President Obama said, you know, let's surge more troops in there, the military said, well, we need, you know, 50,000. He said, okay, well, you can have 30,000 because we got those other guys in Iraq. And, you know, they didn't say no can do. Probably at some point there should have been some element of saying, you know, we're not getting anywhere. But it was one of the problems we have when we rotate leaders in the military, just like when we rotate administrations in government, is the new guy shows up and he wants to prove himself. You know, it's hard to show up and go, hey, you guys have just wasted 14 years. Why are we doing this? You know, that probably would get you relieved of your command. You know, you're expected to show up and say, yes, sir, we'll do it. And, you know, here we have, we fought basically, H.R. McMaster's, a couple of times I've heard him say that this wasn't a war that we fought over 19 years with a plan and a vision. This was 19 one-year wars where we changed our plan and our goals and our intent and our participants every year. So it's very, very different. And the State Department really got sidelined out of this. And the military was just given marching orders to go forward. And their job is march forward.
Admiral, you had been asked a question in our class, which I kind of wanted to end things with, because hopefully it's an uplifting answer to the dire situation our country finds itself. But say that the president is not reelected, how long will it take to kind of repair some of the damage to our embassies, the State Department, where we people are leaving, have left? Can we fix some of that? Are people going to come back and serve maybe in a more favorable administration?
Well, you know, if I were Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman, who told the truth and then got kind of marched out of his office, I'd have a hard time going back. But I know in his heart, he will come back and he will do his job to the best of his ability because he loves this country. And guys like that, Ambassador Taylor, give me great hope. But a lot of foreign service officers are going to need to be grown because, you know, they're going to have to go places and learn their jobs. What gives me the most hope is I think we have a generation of young people from 18 to 35 who are interested in national service, who are interested in doing the right thing for the rest of the world, who are interested in, you know, taking on the issues like climate change and things. And I think they give me a lot of hope. I know a lot of young people who are studying to work their way into careers in everything from, you know, global health to foreign policy to intelligence. And we need to grow that new generation. We're not going to get a lot of the older guys back. You know, if you were a foreign ambassador for 50 years, like Bill Taylor, he probably wanted to retire. And in fact, he was retired when he was called back. So is he going to come back a second time? Well, he might come back as an advisor, but we really need to grow the next generation. We need to get our kids committed, our grandkids committed. We need to get them to think critically and to ask questions. You know, why are we doing what we're doing? Why, you know, is there a better way? Is this military intervention the only tool that we have? And can we do things better? So I think to answer your question, my hope really is on the 18 to 35-year-olds because I think we've really, I hate to say it, our generation let this get away from us.
Right.
Hate to end on a down note, but we let it get away. But the kids, I hope, are going to save us.
I have a similar question, and that was interesting. You talked about the Peace Corps. This question is, if you were advising Biden, assuming he won, and you were advising him on January 21st, 2021, what would you advise about Afghanistan?
Oh, that's a great question. I might have to think about that one for the next couple of days. What would I advise in Afghanistan? You know, the minute we leave, there will be a vacuum and, you know, the government will collapse. And so the question is, should we leave? And you have to balance against, you know, after 19 years, should we stay and keep throwing money down the drain? I would have to sit down with some people who are there and who actually know what's going on and speak the language and can sense. You know, we used to say, what's going on in the Arab street when we would talk about Egypt or Jordan? You know, what are people talking about in the cafes and coffee shops? I would need to sit down and talk to real experts. You know, I'm essentially an academic here who hasn't been there, but reading other people's notes. And I would have to get somebody who's there right now and talk to them, who has a lot of experience. We probably should be cultivating people who have come from that country as immigrants, speak the language and know the culture, and cultivating them for our foreign service and for our national intelligence agencies, as well as in our military. We need those kinds of people to tell us what's really going on. Because I can tell you, in Desert Storm, you know, every battalion and every platoon had an Arabic-speaking person attached to it, so that when you were in some town or village, you knew what was going on. In this conflict, we had no allies from that part of the world that spoke the languages, and so we were flying blind. And I think that was a huge mistake. We need to cultivate a generation of people. So I'd really have to ask experts, and we really need to work on the foreign service quite a bit.
Thank you very much, Brody. I do want to thank Brody for reaching out and getting you as our speaker on short notice. We look forward to having you back because you have ideas about many theaters of the world, theaters of combat, past stumblings of American foreign policy, but you know what you're talking about. We need people to reach out and to learn from. And also thanks for your service to your country, your many medals that you received, the Legion of Merit, so on. And hopefully you'll be able to come back soon.
Thank you for the invitation today, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And if you have a question, email it to Brody, and she'll send it to me, and we'll try and answer your questions. So back to you.
Anything else, Brody?
No, that's it. That's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Baker.
Brody,
Yes. Who's this?
Nancy,
Okay. Hi, Nancy.
I think that was excellent. It's like taking a graduate class.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, we took 7 classes from him, and they were all like this. It was amazing.
In-person classes?
Yes, we took it was an OLLI class, Osher Lifelong Learning at the Lafayette Library.
Ah, I'll have to sign up for some of those.
Now they're online. Yes, yeah, but Osher classes are nice. And Steve, I'm sorry I didn't have time for your question.
Right. It was a very interesting meeting. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, my question was now in the absence of the United States, because I think we've had so much harm, who's going to be the next country that would really be able to lead the world in a positive way? And unfortunately, I do believe it's going to be China. Not everyone's going to be happy with that, but at least they're willing to make investments in other countries.
Yes, I will copy the chat and I can send him extra questions that we didn't get to.
All right, but it was a very interesting meeting, so thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Would people be interested in hearing him talk about in the future Vietnam or Korea or future wars?
Well, hopefully not future wars, but future,
Yeah,
which way we should go in the future.
Yes. Vietnam could be interesting.
Those are the topics he gave us a suggestion. So, okay. All righty. Well, thank you. And
thank you.
Ending.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Good night.